There are kinds of silences in the world, some natural, some earned, and some that simply should not exist. That morning in St. Mary Mead, the silence was of the third kind. It wasn't just the absence of birdsong or the stillness of leaves heavy with dew. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to press against the walls of Ivy Cottage like a held breath, too deliberate, too heavy. A silence that felt wrong. Miss Jane Marple had always believed in details. In her world, nothing ever simply was. Things meant something. A missed biscuit at tea, a forgotten curtain drawn too early, a half-step hesitation. Each thing spoke, if you knew how to listen. And that morning, her instincts were whispering with urgency. It began just past 10, when she passed Ivy Cottage during her routine walk to the post. The roses had not been trimmed, though Mrs. Maud Renshaw pruned them every Thursday. A dish towel, one corner wet and trailing, hung from the garden gate, a careless detail Maud would never have allowed. And Elsie Hartwell, her longtime companion and housekeeper, stood frozen on the front step with her hand hovering just above the latch, her face pale and vacant as frost. "Elsie," Miss Marple called softly. Elsie turned slowly, her lips parted but no sound coming. Her eyes, usually composed and polite, were wide with something more than sorrow. Fear, perhaps, or the shock that comes from discovering something your mind refuses to accept. I think something's wrong, Miss Marple," she whispered. She didn't answer this morning. The kettle hadn't even been put on. Miss Marple gently guided her aside and entered the house, stepping into the small, warm kitchen that had long been one of the quiet hearts of the village. The scent of cinnamon lingered, faint and oddly cloying, mixing with something acrid that didn't belong. And there she was. Mrs. Renshaw sat at the kitchen table, perfectly upright, as if in the middle of a thought she never finished. Her spectacles lay folded beside her teacup. Her hands rested in her lap. There was no chaos, no broken cup, no gasp of pain captured in time, only stillness. Too still. Miss Marple, calm but deeply alert, stepped closer. The color had already faded from Maud's face, and though her posture remained composed, it was unmistakable. Life had left her. Miss Marple didn't scream. She simply lowered her head, whispering a prayer, then turned to the girl, who stood trembling in the doorway. "I'm afraid she's gone, Elsie." "No." Elsie stepped forward, her voice breaking. No. She was just fine last night. We had our tea." She read from the garden journal. She even joked about the bishop's sermon being duller than usual. Miss Marple rested a comforting hand on her shoulder, her eyes still sweeping the room, registering the untouched biscuit tin, the faintly discolored spice jar, the irregular ash pattern on the hearth rug. "I believe," she said gently, "we must call Dr. Haydock." By the time the village doctor arrived, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. Dr. Haydock performed a preliminary exam while Miss Marple made tea and kept Elsie steady with calm conversation and knowing looks. When the doctor finally returned to the sitting room, his face was grave. "No signs of external trauma," he said. "Heart failure is the most probable cause at first glance. But," he paused, brow furrowed, "there's something off. I'll need to report it." Miss Marple nodded once. "Yes, doctor. I believe you're right to be cautious." Because she had seen things that morning. Things that didn't fit. The tea was steeped but not drunk. The cinnamon biscuits, always freshly baked, were untouched. The smell in the air was not just cinnamon. It was bitter, sharp, and strangely metallic beneath the sweetness. And she remembered something else. Maud Renshaw never removed her glasses while working. Never. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Children laughed near the green. A dog barked at a passing motorbike. But inside Ivy Cottage, a quiet had taken root, a silence that would not be easily lifted, because someone, Miss Marple now suspected, had carefully wrapped that silence around a truth they desperately wanted to stay hidden. And in St. Mary Mead, truths had a habit of finding breath again. By the following morning, the news had passed through St. Mary Mead as swiftly and silently as frost creeping along a windowpane. Mrs. Maud Renshaw, widow, church fundraiser, and baker of the village's most prized cinnamon biscuits, was gone. The whisper of it traveled from the greengrocer to the post office, paused under shawled heads by the chapel gate, and threaded through the market queues like invisible thread. But what truly stirred the village wasn't her death. It was what came after. At Ivy Cottage, the curtains remained drawn. Inside, the scent of lavender sachets lingered uneasily in the air, unable to cover the shadow now cast over every room. Elsie Hartwell moved through the house with uncertain steps, her hands hovering above Maud's belongings as though afraid to disturb what remained. Miss Marple, ever composed, sat by the parlor window, observing quietly. The solicitor, Mr. Pritchard, arrived precisely at 11:10, his hat clutched with ceremonial solemnity. A cautious man with eyes that looked as though they had once cried and decided never to again, he greeted them with soft words and professional detachment. "I'm sorry for the circumstances," he said to Elsie, but Maud was adamant that her will be read promptly. She made amendments. Miss Marple noticed the tremble in the man's hand as he removed the folded parchment from his case. The paper was recent, too recent, dated only 2 days prior. "She called me urgently on Monday," Pritchard continued, unfolding the document. "Seemed flustered. Spoke of closure and a need for truth." The reading began. For a woman of modest means, Maud Renshaw's affairs were surprisingly well ordered. A small sum to the church, a bequest of family china to a niece in Cornwall. But then came the shock. "To my faithful companion and housekeeper, Miss Elsie Hartwell, I leave Ivy Cottage, its contents, and the remainder of my personal savings in recognition of her years of loyalty, her quiet strength, and her understanding." Elsie let out an audible gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "But she never said." Miss Marple reached over and laid a steady hand upon hers. Pritchard paused, then added with deliberate weight, "There's also a sealed letter marked for Mr. Tom Renshaw, to be opened only when he has learned the truth." Tom Renshaw, Maud's grown son, had not yet arrived. Word was he had been summoned from London, where he worked in construction, or at least had until recently. He was not a frequent visitor, and his last stay had ended in raised voices and a slammed door. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the hearth, where a single photo stood, Maud and a young Tom, both smiling with unconvincing ease. There had always been talk in the village that Tom had disappointed her, that she loved him deeply, but from a distance. Now Maud had left him nothing. By early afternoon, the village had something new to chew on. A servant had inherited everything. A son had been disinherited, and a letter existed, but no one knew what it said, or what truth it referred to. Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the churchyard later that day, her mind ticking with subtle gears. Something in the will did not feel like revenge. No, Maud Renshaw had never struck her as bitter, only burdened. The kind of woman who carried a secret not for her own sake, but for someone else's protection. As she passed the low iron gate of the cemetery, she paused. There, among the older gravestones, was one she hadn't visited in years. Infant girl Hartwell. Died 1910. A single night among us. Miss Marple stood in silence, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Names had a way of traveling through time in small villages. So did consequences. Later that evening, Tom Renshaw arrived. He stood at the door of Ivy Cottage with mud on his boots and disbelief etched across his face. He listened to the reading in stony silence, and when Pritchard handed him the sealed envelope, his fingers twitched. He didn't open it. Not yet. "She never said I wasn't hers," he muttered, "whatever that means." Elsie offered tea, but Tom declined. His jaw worked back and forth with unspoken fury. The room filled with an unease thicker than grief. And then he left, without another word. Miss Marple remained behind, watching Elsie closely. "Maud trusted you deeply," she said softly. Elsie's eyes filled, but she nodded. "She said once that some kindnesses must live quietly, that not all love needs to be explained." Outside, the sky had turned the color of slate. A single bird called out and received no answer, and in the shadows of Ivy Cottage, something waited, a past that had never truly gone to rest. It was nearing midnight when the village clock, faithful for nearly 70 years, failed to chime. In St. Mary Mead, such a silence was not merely noticed, it was felt, the kind of silence that deepens rather than soothes. the kind that settles into a house like a visitor waiting for someone to speak first. At Ivy Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, a book in her lap, though she had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. From the far end of the lane, she had seen the glow of Tom Renshaw's cigarette earlier, pacing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. A man who carried anger like a second skin. But more than that, confusion, betrayal even. And inside the cottage, Elsie moved through the darkened rooms like a ghost in her own life. Miss Marple had offered to stay the night, and Elsie hadn't protested. Grief had thinned her voice, made her movements uncertain. But there was something else beneath her sorrow. A weight of knowledge. A reluctance to breathe too deeply near the truth. At just past 1 o'clock, a sound disturbed the night. It was faint, a clink, no louder than silver against porcelain, but it did not belong to sleeping hours. Miss Marple rose soundlessly and stepped into the narrow hallway. There, from the kitchen, a thread of light leaked beneath the door. She opened it slowly. Tom Renshaw was seated at the table. The sealed letter lay open before him. His hands trembled not with rage now, but something far more fragile. "I couldn't wait," he said, without looking up. "I had to know." Miss Marple moved quietly to the stove and poured 2 cups of tea. She offered him one and said nothing. "She wasn't my mother," Tom whispered. "At least, not by blood." Miss Marple sipped gently, the steam curling upward between them. "She said in the letter that I was loved, that she never meant to deceive me, that it was meant as protection, not punishment." Tom looked up then, eyes red-rimmed. "Protection from what?" Miss Marple considered him carefully. "Do you want the comfortable lie, or the difficult truth?" "I've already had the lie. It didn't keep me warm." A long silence passed. The clock on the mantel, too old to chime, seemed to listen. "She never told me who my real mother was," Tom said, softer now. "Just that she had no choice. That Elsie knew. That it wasn't her secret to give." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Sometimes," she said, "mothers are chosen, not born. And sometimes the past refuses to remain in the grave we dig for it." Tom rubbed his face, weary. "So what now? What am I supposed to do with this?" "Forgive her," Miss Marple said, her voice almost too gentle, "and ask the questions you were always too angry to ask." He looked at the letter again, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. "I should speak to Elsie." "She's in the garden," Miss Marple said simply. Tom blinked. "At this hour?" She said she couldn't sleep. The roses needed watering, apparently. He left the kitchen quietly. Miss Marple remained, staring out at the hedge beyond the window. In the silence that followed, she thought of something Maud Renshaw had once told her many years ago, during an afternoon of tea and crosswords. "Jane," she had said, "secrets are like biscuit tins. You think you've sealed them tight, but time has a way of prying the lid." And now the lid was off. From the garden, voices carried faintly. Tom's voice, tentative, wounded. Elsie's, trembling, maternal. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the old village clock began ticking again. Not chiming, just ticking, as if something long stuck had finally remembered how to move. By mid-morning, a thin drizzle had settled over St. Mary Mead, the kind that left a sheen over every surface and soaked through wool coats with the slow patience of grief. Ivy Cottage stood in stillness, its shutters closed against the gray. Inside, the scent of cinnamon still lingered faintly in the air, though now it carried with it the sorrow of a home that had once been filled with warmth and was now draped in shadows. Miss Marple stood in the parlor, reading a note left on the hall table by Tom. "Gone to walk with Elsie. Need time. Thank you." It was underlined twice, as if gratitude were something that needed reinforcing when the past had turned so violently unexpected. She was just about to return to her knitting when the knock came. It was sharp, precise, not the uncertain rap of a mourner, nor the lazy tap of a neighbor checking in. It was the sound of purpose, of someone who already knew they were expected. When Miss Marple opened the door, she found a young man standing there, rein in his hair, a folded paper in his hand. "Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice polite but uncertain. "Yes, I'm Charles Watson. I believe you may be expecting me." She stepped aside without a word. Inside, with the fire gently crackling and tea warming their hands, Charles looked around the parlor as if trying to memorize it. "My mother never told me much," he said. "Only that my father died before I was born, that he was German, that she met him during the war, while working on a farm in Kent." He glanced down at the letter he held, its edges worn, its ink faded from rereading. "She died 2 years ago," he continued, his voice thickening. "Before she passed, she gave me this. It had an address, Mrs. Maud Renshaw, Ivy Cottage, St. Mary Mead. She said if I wanted answers, this was the only place left to look." Miss Marple took the letter and read it silently. It was written in a woman's hand, firm, hurried, afraid. It spoke of a man named Klaus, a summer of brief kindness, a farewell never spoken, and one line stood out above all. "I have never forgiven myself for keeping his memory from our son. If you wish to find him, find her." Miss Marple looked up. "You believe your father was Klaus Weber?" "I don't know what I believe. Only that. I needed to come. I need to understand." She nodded gently. "There are truths here, Charles, but they are fragile, like bone beneath frost. You must step carefully." Before he could reply, another knock came, softer this time. It was Elsie. She froze in the doorway when she saw the stranger. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but you look so much like him." Charles rose. "I think I may be your nephew." Elsie blinked, then stepped backward into the rain, as if needing to breathe in something bigger than the moment could hold. Miss Marple watched them from the window as they spoke in the garden, the mist blurring their silhouettes. There was no anger, no outburst, just a long, delicate unwinding of threads that had been knotted for too many years. Later that evening, as dusk deepened and the firelight flickered, Miss Marple sat with Tom, Charles, and Elsie at the same table where Maud Renshaw once rolled cinnamon into biscuits and folded secrets into silence. Charles spoke of his mother. Tom listened, his brow furrowed, as he slowly began to accept that the man whose name had always been a ghost in his home had been more than just a stranger in a photograph. And when the clock chimed 8, Miss Marple rose quietly and went into the kitchen. There, tucked beneath the sugar tin, she found a plain envelope with no address. It had been slipped through the back door, unnoticed during the afternoon rain. She opened it. Inside was a single line, written in unfamiliar script. She should have let sleeping memories lie. There was no signature, no clue, only a warning, the kind that arrives not too late, but precisely when it means to. The next morning brought with it the false cheer of sunlight, the sort that glinted coldly off the rooftops, but failed to warm the bones. The village of St. Mary Mead moved quietly, as it often did after the echo of tragedy. Conversations were hushed, glances lingered a moment too long, and the air carried the kind of stillness that usually follows a confession or a warning. At Ivy Cottage, breakfast had been attempted but left mostly untouched. Tom stared into his cup of tea like it might offer answers, while Elsie moved around the kitchen in silence, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she wiped the counter for the third time. Charles sat at the far end of the table, quietly observing them both, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. Miss Marple had excused herself early, citing errands, though she had no particular business in the village that day. Instead, she made her way to the vicarage garden, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, could often be found tending to her prized lavender bushes. The older woman was hunched over the flower beds, wearing gloves and a scarf knotted tight at the throat despite the growing warmth. "Such a pleasant surprise, Miss Marple," she said, rising with a forced smile. "I hope you've not come to discuss more dreadful things. The village has had quite its fill of scandal." Miss Marple smiled back gently, but her eyes did not soften. "No, no. I was only admiring your lavender. I recall Maud Renshaw once said your garden was the envy of Meadowbank." Mrs. Clement looked down sharply, the name clearly unsettling her. "Maud had a way of being overly generous with her praise," she said, brushing her gloved fingers along the stems. "But it was kind of her. I understand she used to bake with her own dried herbs and spices." Miss Marple continued idly. "She had a particular fondness for cinnamon." The vicar's wife hesitated for a moment. Then, too quickly, she nodded. Yes, she did. And you helped her with baking for church events, I believe? Mrs. Clement straightened. Occasionally, but only in passing. I'm afraid I'm rather useless in the kitchen, really. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped closer and plucked a small sprig of lavender, rolling it gently between her fingers. It's strange, isn't it? She said softly. How some plants are both lovely and dangerous. Did you know, for instance, that castor plants, beautiful as they are, contain a poison so potent it can kill within hours? Mrs. Clement froze. Miss Marple did not miss the flicker of panic in her eyes before she turned her face away, muttering something about the sun being too harsh. The older woman excused herself moments later, retreating into the house, leaving the flowers and the conversation abruptly behind. Miss Marple stood in the garden for a long moment after that, staring not at the lavender, but at the small bed near the fence where the soil had been turned recently. Too recently, as if something had been buried, or perhaps unearthed. That afternoon, she returned to Ivy Cottage, where Charles and Tom were seated in the parlor, an old family photo album spread open between them. Elsie stood by the window, her hands clasped in front of her, listening but not yet ready to speak. I've been thinking, Charles said slowly, about that letter, the one Maud wrote me, and the one she left for Tom, the thing she was trying to put right. What if she knew she was in danger? Tom looked up. You think someone killed her? Because of that. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she placed the anonymous note on the table, the one she had received the previous evening. Tom read it aloud, his voice tightening. She should have let sleeping memories lie. Elsie gasped softly. Charles looked from the note to Miss Marple. You think that was meant as a warning? No, she replied. I believe it was meant as a threat. They sat in silence, the old clock ticking gently above the hearth. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind clouds once more, and the wind had picked up, rustling through the trees like someone moving just out of sight. And inside, in the quiet gloom of the parlor, the truth waited, coiled and patient, beneath years of polite lies and buried pain. But not for much longer. The next day broke without ceremony. A pale, uncertain light drifted through the curtains of Ivy Cottage, casting soft lines across the floor like the ghosts of old hallways. The morning air carried a scent of earth and distant rain, and though the church bells rang as they always did, there was a weight in their toll, a heaviness that pressed against the village like a hand on glass. Miss Marple stood once again in the narrow pathway between the hedgerows that separated the vicarage grounds from the old churchyard. In her hand, she held a letter she had not expected to receive. It had arrived without a sender, tucked discreetly under the handle of her back gate. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as though written by a person who feared even the act of truth-telling. It wasn't meant to end that way. We only wanted to silence the past, not the future. But she knew. She remembered, and she intended to make us all remember too. Signed only, a friend who regrets. Miss Marple folded the letter and slipped it inside her handbag. Her walk took her toward the walled garden of the vicarage, a place she had visited often during tea socials and charity luncheons over the years. Today, the garden felt different, less cultivated, more watchful. She found Reverend Clement among the roses, tending quietly to a trellis with careful fingers. You look concerned, Jane, he said, not turning as she approached. I am Vicar, she replied, her voice soft but steady. I'm concerned that something terribly human has happened in our peaceful little village, and that the roots of it go deeper than any of us have wanted to admit. The vicar looked up at that, his expression tired. I fear you may be right. Lena, my wife, has not been herself. No, Miss Marple agreed. She has not. That evening, a storm gathered. The sky darkened early, and thunder rolled like distant drums. At Ivy Cottage, Tom sat quietly with a bundle of old documents spread out on the table, letters, land receipts, notes from Mrs. Renshaw's private boxes. Charles, seated across from him, held a page written in Klaus Weber's own hand, sent from a POW camp in 1945. I hope one day I will see the boy, if the world allows it, if there is mercy left. I think he knew. Charles said quietly. About me. About her. About the child. I think he hoped for a future that never came. Elsie stood near the fire, her arms crossed tightly. She never stopped loving him, she said, her voice fragile. Even when Henry returned, even when everyone told her to forget, she never did. Miss Marple, listening from her chair, looked not at the fire, but at the small wooden box in Elsie's hand, a spice box, the same one from which the poisoned cinnamon had come. I'm afraid someone else never forgot either, she said, rising. And jealousy, when left too long in the soul, becomes like rot in the roots of a tree. You can't always see it, but it weakens everything above. As the storm broke outside, thunder shaking the windows and wind twisting through the village like an angry whisper, Miss Marple turned toward the door. I believe it's time, she said, to visit the rose bed behind the vicarage greenhouse. Tom and Charles exchanged a glance. There's something buried there, she added, something that doesn't belong. And if I'm right, it won't just be soil we disturb. It will be memory. And so, in the thickening dusk, with rain falling soft as confession, they stepped out into the garden. What they found there beneath the earth would cast light on everything they thought they understood, and shatter what peace remained for those who had spent their lives trying to bury the truth. Rain fell in a steady hush as the four of them, Miss Marple, Tom, Charles, and Elsie, walked out into the garden behind the vicarage greenhouse. The wind moved through the hedges like breath through lungs too long silent, and the gravel beneath their feet crackled faintly with each careful step. They reached the rose bed just past the old sundial, where a patch of earth, though modestly tended, looked newer than the rest. The roses here had always struggled to bloom, Reverend Clement once said, despite the soil being no different from any other corner of the garden. Some ground simply refuses to bear beauty, he had remarked once, almost absently. Miss Marple remembered that now. She handed a small spade to Tom, who hesitated before sinking the blade into the damp soil. It feels wrong, he murmured. Truth often does, Miss Marple said gently. But wrongness unspoken can fester until it poisons everything it touches. It did not take long. Only a foot beneath the surface, wrapped in what was once oilcloth, but had now decayed into threads of black, they found it. A tin box. Small. Sealed. Cold. Tom lifted it with shaking hands and set it on the flagstone path. Charles knelt beside him and gently pried it open. Inside, time itself seemed to shiver. There were letters, dozens of them, some in Klaus Weber's hand, others in the delicate, looping script of Maud Renshaw. And tucked beneath these, pressed flat against the bottom, was a photograph. Faded, torn at one corner. It showed Klaus, smiling faintly, standing beside a young woman whose face bore unmistakable echoes of Tom's. Behind them, the broken fence of Meadowbank Farm. The date scrawled on the back read, August 1944. And then there was the necklace. It was small, simple. A silver chain holding a charm shaped like a lily. It matched the one Elsie had always worn, passed down by Maud in her final years. But this one was different. This one had initials etched into its back, LM. Lena Morrison, Miss Marple whispered. Elsie gasped. She knew, Charles said softly. Mrs. Clement knew everything. She was there. She saw it. Maybe more. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She wasn't just an observer. She was a participant. A jealous young woman in wartime, watching the man she loved fall in love with another. And when Maud decided to tell the truth after all these years, she knew it would all come to light, including her own betrayal. But why bury this here? Tom asked, confused. Why under the rose bed? Because secrets, Miss Marple said, her voice low and certain, don't like to stay far from their keepers. And I believe Mrs. Clement tended this garden with a reverence only the guilty know. She buried it not to hide it forever, but to keep it close. And now that Maud was ready to speak, she knew she had only two choices: let it surface, or silence it again. Elsie sat down on the stone edge of the bed, tears threading down her cheeks. I always wondered, she said brokenly, why Maud kept those cinnamon biscuits locked in that tin. Why she guarded that Old Spice box like it held diamonds. She knew, didn't she? She knew someone would come for her the moment she chose to tell. Miss Marple rested a hand on her shoulder. She knew, but she chose the truth anyway. Lightning cracked far off in the hills. The storm was beginning to pass. Tom turned to Charles, his expression full of unspoken weight. She did it for you. For your father. For all of us. Charles held his gaze. And now we owe her the justice she never asked for. Miss Marple rose. We'll take these letters to Inspector Slack in the morning, she said. And after that, I believe it's time for one final conversation with a vicar's wife who has buried too many things under too many layers of propriety. She looked back once at the broken earth, and the wind, gentle now, moved the rose leaves with something like a sigh. Morning light came hesitant through the vicarage windows, stained pale by low clouds and the faint drizzle that veiled St. Mary Mead. In Miss Marple's parlor, the kettle had just begun to hum, but the room was already tense with expectancy. Elsie sat with hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes still raw from the night before. Tom paced silently near the fireplace, while Charles, standing by the bookshelf, turned over one of Klaus's letters again and again between his fingers. Miss Marple, seated primly in her favorite chair, was calm, but the softness in her expression held something steely behind it. She was waiting for the last guest. At precisely 10:30, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Clement entered in her usual pearl-gray coat, her hat pinned just so, her hands gloved even in the warmth of June. She was composed, her mouth fixed in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jane, dear," she said lightly, "I came as you requested. I do hope this won't take long. There's a flower rota to finalize for the altar this weekend." "Please sit," Miss Marple said, gesturing to the armchair across from her. "I believe it's time we speak plainly." For a few moments, nothing moved. Then Mrs. Clement settled herself with a careful grace, as if she already knew that the ground beneath her had begun to shift. "I know," Miss Marple said gently, "that you were once Eleanora Morrison, a land girl posted to Meadowbank Farm in 1944. Mrs. Clement stiffened, but said nothing. "I know," Miss Marple continued, "that you were fond of Klaus Weber, that you may have imagined there was something between you, and that, when you realized his affections were fixed elsewhere, on Maud, you felt betrayed." Still no reply. "Jealousy is a fierce thing," Miss Marple murmured, "and wartime is not kind to the lonely. So you informed the authorities of Klaus's relationship, knowing it would mean his removal. Perhaps you hoped that would end it. But something went wrong, and Klaus died." Mrs. Clement's hands clenched in her lap. "You buried it all," Miss Marple said. "That guilt, that shame. You married the vicar, reinvented yourself, became the very model of rectitude." "I have served this village for 30 years, Mrs. Clement said suddenly, her voice tight and low. "I have helped raise children, cared for the sick, led fundraisers, given every bit of my life." "To atone?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Silence fell. "I didn't poison her," Mrs. Clement whispered. "Not at first. I mean, I didn't know what she was planning. But when I saw the letter, when I realized she was writing to that boy, that she was going to tell Tom, and the village would learn what I had done." She covered her mouth with her gloved hand, trembling. "I only wanted to stop it." "You brought the spice tin," Miss Marple said. "You were baking at the church that afternoon. No one questioned you. You've always been trusted." "I used only a pinch," Mrs. Clement whispered. "It wouldn't have worked if she hadn't used it that day." "But she did," Miss Marple said gently. "And now she is gone." Tom rose slowly. "You took her from us." Mrs. Clement looked up, and for the first time, her eyes were truly bare. "I took her for myself, Tom. She forgave me once, long ago, and I killed that forgiveness with fear." "I will call Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said softly. "But first, I wanted you to understand the cost." As she stood, Mrs. Clement removed her gloves with shaking hands. Her dignity was still intact, but it clung to her now like a damp shawl, more sorrow than pride. "I do understand," she said, and for once, her voice carried no pretense. Miss Marple watched her go, escorted by the constable who had waited outside. There were no handcuffs. Not yet. But there would be. The room was quiet. Elsie wept softly into her handkerchief. Tom sat beside her, his face pale but resolute. Charles moved to the window and stared out across the garden, where roses bloomed over newly turned earth. "It's strange," he said. "I didn't know my father, but somehow this makes him real." Miss Marple nodded. "Truth has a way of doing that. It brings people back to us, even after death." She poured the tea, and for the first time since Maud's passing, the house felt light again. It had rained during the night, the kind of rain that polished the cobblestones and left the hedges glistening like freshly washed lace. Morning broke with a hush over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were holding its breath after all that had unfolded. At Ivy Cottage, the windows were open to let in the scent of damp earth and rose blossom, and inside, the stillness had changed, no longer the silence of morning, but the quiet that follows a confession, raw and oddly clean. Miss Marple sat with her teacup cooling in her hands, watching as Tom Renshaw and Charles Watson strolled slowly through the garden. From time to time, their voices reached her, tentative, uncertain, but growing warmer. Two strangers learning, hesitantly, how to call each other family. Elsie Hartwell was in the kitchen, busying herself with breakfast preparations, though she'd prepared enough for a small army. Her movements were brisk, purposeful, but Miss Marple could see the difference in her, the lifted shoulders, the new steadiness in her voice. For the first time in years, she was walking fully in her own name. Not just the devoted housekeeper, but mother, acknowledged and embraced. Charles was to remain for a week. He had written from London that morning, asking his supervisor for a leave of absence, explaining, without detail, that family matters long buried had surfaced and deserved tending. The reply had come within hours. He would stay in Maud's house, sleeping in the room that had once been reserved for guests, while Tom and Elsie quietly shifted into a rhythm that would, in time, come to feel natural. Miss Marple stepped outside to join them in the garden. Charles knelt beside the rose bed, brushing dirt from his palms. "She planted these," he said softly. "Didn't she?" "Every spring," Tom replied. "Like clockwork. Even in her last year, when her hands were stiff, I offered to do it for her, but she said it mattered that she touch the earth herself." Charles reached out and gently righted a drooping bloom. "I think she was waiting for something," he said. "Or someone." Miss Marple folded her hands around her walking stick. "She was waiting for peace," she said quietly, "and I believe she has it now." They were interrupted by the gentle creak of the garden gate. It was Reverend Clement, walking slowly, his hat in his hands. He looked older than usual, more burdened, but when he saw Miss Marple, his expression steadied. "I came to ask if I might offer a blessing," he said, "for Maud, for the house, for all of you." Elsie stepped out of the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour. She nodded. In the garden, under the soft green shade of the old pear tree, they gathered. The Reverend's prayer was simple, no more than a few lines, but his voice trembled as he said Maud's name, and when he finished, even the birds seemed to pause a moment before continuing their morning song. Miss Marple watched as Tom and Charles stood side by side. She noted the way Charles rested a hand on his half-brother's shoulder, the way Tom didn't flinch. These were men shaped by different stories, carrying different shadows, but here, in this small garden, where one woman's memory bloomed with every petal, they had found something shared. Forgiveness, perhaps, or the beginnings of it. Later, over tea, Elsie brought out a small tin box, Maud's. Inside were photographs, letters, a pressed flower. She passed it to Charles, who opened it slowly. A faded photograph of Klaus Weber was among the keepsakes. His eyes were kind, his expression serious. Charles stared at it for a long time, then looked at Miss Marple. "Do you think he ever imagined any of this?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, but I believe he hoped for it. And sometimes hope, left quietly in the heart of a woman like Maud Renshaw, takes root even decades later." As evening fell over the village, and the golden hour made the garden glow, Miss Marple rose to take her leave. She paused at the gate, looking back once. The three of them stood in the fading light, Tom, Charles, and Elsie, no longer divided by lies, but joined by the courage it took to face them. And behind them, in the window of Ivy Cottage, the light flickered softly. Not the light of sorrow, but of a home finally at rest. A week had passed since the truth was laid bare like freshly tilled earth, and in that time, the village of St. Mary Mead, resilient as always, began the quiet work of healing. Gossip, which had once circled Ivy Cottage like crows over a harvest field, had now softened into respectful curiosity. Neighbors no longer whispered about Tom Renshaw's inheritance or Mrs. Clement's arrest with the same urgency. They spoke instead of Miss Marple's roses, of the changing seasons, and of the rare beauty of seeing the past make peace with the present. Miss Marple sat beneath her garden arbor that warm afternoon, her lace shawl draped across her shoulders, the soft clicking of her knitting needles in rhythmic time with the birdsong around her. Her hands moved with purpose, but her mind drifted, meandering down old paths as it so often did when a case was closed, but the questions lingered. Maud Renshaw had died not because she was cruel, or careless, or even foolish. She had died because she dared to unearth something long buried, not for her own sake, but for the sake of others. In doing so, she had disturbed the quiet facade that certain people had built their lives upon. And those facades, Miss Marple knew too well, were often held together by fear more than strength. She thought of Eleanina Clement, once Eleanina Morrison, now sitting alone in a cold county cell, awaiting the slow turning of justice. A woman who had sacrificed truth for reputation, who had bartered peace of mind for a hollow stability. And in the end, guilt had proved heavier than even murder. It was a lesson Miss Marple had seen written into many lives, that secrets, however deeply buried, tend to sprout when watered by time and memory. You could ignore them. You could wall them off, dress them in civility, call them something else entirely. But eventually they surfaced. In letters, in photographs, in the eyes of a son asking who he truly was. She was interrupted by a gentle knock at the garden gate. It was Charles Watson again, holding a small box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Something I wanted you to have," he said with a modest smile. "You helped bring him back to me in a way. I thought this belonged with you." Inside the box was a single photograph, Klaus Weber in uniform, standing in a sunlit field, not far from what looked like Meadowbank Farm. His eyes held that same quiet strength Miss Marple had seen in Charles. She looked up. "You resemble him, you know, in the way you listen more than you speak." Charles flushed, then nodded. "My mother never told me anything, but I think she hoped I would find the truth eventually. I'm just grateful it was here I found it." They sat for a while beneath the arbor, drinking tea as the village bells marked the hour. Charles spoke of plans to return to London, but also of perhaps visiting more often, perhaps even moving nearer. Tom, he said, was adjusting. They were learning to laugh together, to argue, to sit in companionable silence. Family, slowly forming from fragments. After he left, Miss Marple sat alone a little longer, finishing the edge of the blanket she had been knitting. It was to be gifted to a young couple in Much Benham who had just welcomed their first child. A small thing. But small things, she believed, often carried the weight of the world. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned to gold behind the yew trees, Miss Marple rose. The wind stirred the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter rose like a promise. Yes, the past had its ghosts, but the future, when gently mended, could still hold light. She stepped inside, drawing the door shut behind her, and the final stitch of the story fell into place.